Right, shall we make a start? It's very good to see so many of you here at Bloomsbury House, the Institute's forward deployed location, given the lifts are out at Arundel House, so thanks very much for all of you for coming along. Very pleased to welcome you all here to, I think, what's the inaugural London event of the Cyberspace and Future Conflict programme at the ISS. Very pleased to welcome Greg Austin, who's based in Singapore, who's a Senior Fellow for Cyberspace and Future Conflict, and Marcus Willett, who's a Senior Advisor. We're going to talk about a couple of issues, a number of issues relating to methodologies for assessing cyber power and those methodologies applied in the case of the United States that Greg will cover. I, of course, have to declare that I've got a hat in the ring here because in the military balance we've for a number of years conducted pen portrait assessments of cyber power, and in the forthcoming 2020 edition we have a methodological piece and some outline indicators that we're going to use moving forward for an assessment of military-owned cyber capability that maybe we can get onto later in the broader methodological discussion. Some house rules. This event's being filmed and it's all on the record, but the filming will stop after the presentation, which will give you a bit more freedom, we hope, to engage in a more frank and wide-ranging Q&A. Mobile phones to silent, please. And Greg will speak now for about 30-35 minutes and will be followed then by Marcus. Greg, over to you.
James.
Thanks.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. My pleasure to be here in Bloomsbury House at Virginia Woolf Room. And as James said, we're here to launch some of the work that the IISS has been undertaking on measuring cyber power. The work I'll be presenting on will be around our assessments of the United States cyber power, but with a special focus on US Cyber Command, partly because it gives an interesting angle on the overall question that we've posed, but also because it's the 10th anniversary of Cyber Command. So we're going to have a little bit of a question on this slide after I read to you something from our assessment. So you might just like to sort of have a look at that, try and work out where it's from, what it means, and what's missing from the slide. But I'd like to just give you an overview of our assessment of United States coercive capacity in cyberspace before I get to some of the teaser questions in the presentation. So in draft, these assessments that we've got will be published, revised and published probably towards May. But in draft, our assessment of US capability for coercion in cyberspace is that it's at a very high level, arguably more developed than for any other country in the world. And there are several foundational elements to this capability. The first is high-grade intelligence collection and analysis. It's an essential foundation for cyber coercion, and the United States sits at the pinnacle of the largest, most technologically advanced intelligence alliance in human history. The closest allies, the UK, Canada, Australia, Israel and France, are all among the top 10 countries in most measures of intelligence capability. No potential adversary can come close to matching this level of intelligence power that the US-led alliance possesses. Second, space-based ISR assets underpin global cyber strike capabilities. And the United States is the leader in the world in military uses of outer space, especially those related to cyber strike. Third, the United States has a world-leading capability for human intelligence collection and analysis by non-technical means that underpins exploitation of human sources and human assets for cyber strike. Fourth, the US government has a highly effective means for temporary ad hoc engagement of high-value cyber strike assets that exist in its private sector and its universities, either in the United States or outside it. No other country comes even close to matching the United States network of available private sector and academic sources for participation in coercive activities of the sort that the United States has. Fifth, the United States was the first great power to shift decisively to military transformation based on the concept of information dominance, and is now more than 25 years into that process. It is supported by a national talent pool that is unsurpassed in educational foundations for cyber strike. 6, the country has highly developed doctrines and legal authorities for a range of coercive actions in cyberspace, both for situations below the level of armed conflict and for high intensity combat. 7th, we can assume that the United States has access to arsenals of cyber weapons, since it has been developing them for over 2 decades, and because there's a very large number of them available on the open market, and because there's a growing gap between vulnerabilities in new equipment globally and the capacities of owners to consistently patch the vulnerabilities. So now that we've celebrated the great strength of the United States in cyber coercive potential, what we have to say is a little bit more humbling. The United States has been prepared to disclose its coercive potential in a small number of publicly revealed incidents, including its publicly announced cyber deterrence initiative. But the United States regards knowledge of its cyber arsenal and its planned uses as amongst the most important secrets in the country. So that presents a very large problem for analysts like us in the International Institute of Strategic Studies trying to come to terms with the problem set. So against that broad background of that assessment, I'd like to walk through some points around the work of Cyber Command and what we do know about it and how we might begin to understand it. So the first test for this afternoon was really what's missing from this and where does that particular slide come from. It comes from the 1983 movie War Games, which involved a geeky sort of student type getting in touch with an artificial intelligence contained in the Strategic Command, or NORAD I think it was called at the time, and engaging in a game. The artificial intelligence asked the geeky student type what game he would like to play, and of course the artificial intelligence chose global thermonuclear war without really appreciating the difference between global thermonuclear war and bridge. But what's missing from that 1983 slide is of course global cyber warfare, global cyber conflict, something like that. So this is really pre the cyber era, but in fact it was a very interesting precursor, because Ronald Reagan, after seeing this movie, went into the National Security Council and asked his chiefs, he said, can we really do that? Is that possible? Can somebody hack NORAD? And they went away and came back to him a short time later, a month or so, a few weeks, and said, the bad news, Mr. President, is that they can. So that was really the departure point, according to well-informed insider, of how the United States government started to pay attention to it. So it's not 1983 that's really the start point, it's 7 or 8 years later, but it is an early departure point. I mentioned the proposition that details of United States cyber capability are highly classified, but there's another problem in our analysis of what cyber coercive power is, and that is that we're involved in a debate in the academic community, in the think tank community, about whether there's a cyber revolution in military affairs. Most people recognise that there's been a revolution, an information revolution in the world, but many people are not prepared to accept that that's had the corresponding impact in military affairs. And Deputy Secretary of Defence in the United States in 2017 made the observation that there's no greater sin in his community than to advocate for the proposition that cyber military capability is transformational of the nature of war. So we're locked in this situation where the academic community is divided between the proposition that cyberspace or cyber capability is some sort of add-on. So you've got artillery units, you've got submarines, and you've got cyber capability, or whether it's completely transformational, cuts through all those capabilities, and is so transformational that it might impact the nature of war. Most people are familiar with the title of Thomas Reid's book, at least, There Will Not Be Cyber War, but that goes with an orthodoxy in the RAND Corporation in particular, which is that cyber capability can have important military effects, but almost never at the strategic level of war. And so that's a proposition probably might have been correct at the first time that RAND put that forward, but we have to ask ourselves whether it's going to continue to be correct or is even still correct. One of the ways of approaching the question of cyber conflict and what it is to understand that regardless of whether or not Thomas's argument about whether there will be a cyber war or not is correct, and by and large it is correct in the terms that he framed it. But what the book doesn't talk about is that at the time he wrote it, both the United States and China were considering how they could develop the capability for multi-vector, multi-wave, multi-theatre cyber attacks on a sustained basis. And the purpose of those attacks is to degrade your capability, your legitimacy to conduct war, and your capability, the physical control of your warfighting assets. One thing that is sort of rather interesting about this debate, and the Deputy Secretary's remarks that I mentioned earlier relate to it, is the proposition that whenever we talk about cyber war, we've got to be Clausewitzian. We've got to accept the proposition that any use of cyber capability in military conflict proves everything about Clausewitz, whatever maxim it was from Clausewitz, it's all true regardless of the information revolution. And I'm a great fan of Clausewitz, and I think that by and large that proposition is not so seriously contestable. But I think it is useful to think about the ways in which cyber military capability transform the relationship between politics and the use of force. And we go back to the Deputy Secretary's comments from 2017. So, Cyber Command is one of 11 unified combatant commands. Some look, what you might call, I won't use the word thematic, that's the wrong word, but in a sense global in scope. Strategic Command, Cyber Command, Space Command, Special Ops. Others look a little bit more geographically based. And then we've got this unusual thing, the one mentioned at the bottom, transportation, which is not necessarily so global in scope, but nonetheless essential. Now what's interesting about reflecting on the 11 cyber combatant commands is that when the United States set up Cyber Command, it wasn't setting up some little add-on capability. It was setting up a massively, in its own view, strategically decisive capability. And if you were to listen to some strategic scholars about the importance of cyber warfare, cyber military capability, you'd think that the Americans had over-invested in this thing called Cyber Command. I've mentioned the proposition that not all combatant commands are equal. We might decide that Cyber Command is really the equal of Transportation Command, or we might decide that it's actually as important as Strategic Command. But one thing about Cyber Command, which makes it a little bit different, is that it's co-located with National Security Agency, and it's co-located with other capabilities which reinforce the inherent overall capacity of Cyber Command to deliver coercive operations. And on the screen there you may not be able to see it, but each of the single services has its own Cyber Command, Army, Navy, Air Force and Marine Corps. What's particularly interesting about the relativity between NSA and Cyber Command is that NSA has many more assets, has a much bigger budget, and delivers for Cyber Command some of the things that Cyber Command likes to do in the military domain. So understanding CyberCom, even though it was only set up in 2009, in my view depends on understanding what went before Cyber Command. And if we go back to 1992, which is really about the same time that professionals in information technology started to think about information security. In fact, it's about 10 years after the first articles appeared on information security. But by the time that debate about information security became a bit more intense, the Department of Defence directed its key units to begin planning for command and control warfare or information warfare. And there's a number of milestones reflected on that slide. One of the more interesting, I guess, is that in 1997, the United States conducted an exercise against its own National Military Command Centre and found that it was able to breach it in significant ways. So that would be a big wake-up call to the United States military leadership. So we got to 2009 with the establishment of Cyber Command. That was about the same time that Stuxnet was, making itself felt in the centrifuges in Iran. The planning for Stuxnet probably began around 2007. But we have to ask ourselves, when the United States government decided it was going to attack Iran with the Stuxnet worm, was that the first ever use by it of a cyber attack in wartime? And my answer to that is no, and some other people will agree with me. In 1999, according to a variety of sources, the United States Air Force launched a cyber attack on the Belgrade electric grid. Now, this is a proposition that's disputed among scholars, but there is reliable collateral for that proposition, and then there's special sources which allow us to make a firm judgment that that actually happened. And it's not unrelated in my view, although the attack on the Belgrade grid and the attack on the Chinese embassy were not connected, but the two events had a very profound effect on the Chinese government's appreciation of what the United States was planning to do in cyberspace. And so what we find through the early decade of this century is that planning for military operations in cyberspace was visible, active, and productive. And so by the time the Stuxnet attack was launched, that was not the first time the United States considered use of military capability in cyberspace. So, I don't want to appear frivolous, but one thing I found that in discussing questions of cyber military capability is that people are fixated, or some people are fixated on the idea that the most important cyber attacks of a military character are going to be single vector, one-off attacks, much like we have in civilian cyberspace. But that's not what the governments are planning. And so it's interesting to reflect how many person years have been spent in the United States Department of Defence to develop cyber weapons since 1990. So Cyber Command was set up in 2009. They were developing cyber weapons and attack packages before that. So what's that total of person years? And we'll get back to it later. A high-placed source in the United States suggested that Stuxnet took 23 person years to develop and deliver. So that's question one. Question two, how many unique cyber weapons does Cyber Command have at its disposal? We may never know the answer, but I've got an answer that we can at least reflect on a bit later. And then the final question, what are the secrets of US success in cyberspace that makes it, in our view, at least in the view of this draft assessment we've got, so powerful relative to other countries? We'll get back to these questions later. So what are the resources that Cyber Command disposes? Well, we've seen a gradual evolution in the budget development for Cyber Command from $106 million in 2010 to $610 million in 2019. But interestingly, Cyber Command draws resources from budget allocations in other parts of the budget in the order of billions of dollars. We know that Cyber Command's got about 6,000 people in the broad. Depending on the source you read, it's broken down in different ways. This is one official source which says that Cyber Command has a mission force of 4,406, and then these other military and civilian personnel. And as I mentioned before, Cyber Command can actually draw on some of the resources of NSA, which, although we don't know for sure how big its budget is of the order of 10 billion probably. And in addition to what you might term the single silo of Cyber Command. There's these additional assets outside that I've already referred to, which really buttress the coercive potential of Cyber Command. So, it's pretty clear that when Cyber Command was set up, the full potential of its operation was not, realised in contemporary planning documents, contemporary policy documents. There were quite a few gaps. In 2012, a lot of those gaps were filled by President Obama when he issued the top secret presidential policy directive. It was leaked and is available in the public domain. And the most important thing about that document was that it foreshadowed the application of all aspects of United States military, economic and political power to develop cyber capabilities. Second interesting aspect of that document was that it reserved the authority for offensive political action exclusively to the President of the United States. So that was a very sort of good framing, sort of constraining sort of element at the time. By the time we got to the vision statement in 2015 of the commander of Cyber Command, they moved to this proposition I mentioned before, a different expression of this idea of multi-vector, multi-wave attacks, and the proposition was that Cyber Command would develop capabilities for all phases of operations, and that was an explicit statement in the document. Elsewhere, while it's not an explicit quote, it's very clear that they meant at every level of command. By the time we got to the 2018 vision statement, there was a bit of a shift. Maybe Cyber Command didn't want to focus so much on this ambition of all phases of operations and at every level of command, but they certainly shifted to a much bigger strategic vision of competition in cyberspace, of achieving and maintaining superiority, defend forward, expand the military cyber options for national leaders. So it was really a more expansive vision, but I think unrevealed is whether or not they were fully committed by 2018 to that earlier vision of trying to flesh out cyber capability in all phases of operations and at all levels of command. There's evidence that they're pushing in that direction, but it's a pretty slow process and one that's still evolving. So in 2018 we have another top secret presidential policy memorandum. This one has not been leaked, but we know from official sources in the public domain that it shifts the level of authorization for offensive cyber operations from the President downwards in a number of unspecified ways. So if we were trying to, in a sense, give a comprehensive briefing on any military unit of the character of, say, Space Command, Cyber Command, Special Forces Command, or the like, we might be able to sort of run through these things with considerable detail. We can't really with Cyber Command, but I'm just going to sort of touch on a couple of considerations that we know, which will help inform our discussion today and perhaps our work later. Cyber Command works on two sets of missions, basically. One set is offensive and one set is defensive. The largest share of their resources is assigned to defensive missions. But when you think about the interesting dimensions of cyber military operations, we can think about many things in the offensive space that raise all sorts of questions about military strategy, military planning, and strategic options in a way that simply passive defence of your information networks do not. So we can look at a range of terms or phrases which capture some of the options. For example, cyber decapitation, it's the idea that you can launch a cyber attack against the command and control of enemy units or even of nuclear forces and prevent the leadership from engaging the forces at its command. Cyber paralysis, you launch an attack and you cripple the functioning of an economy or the functioning of armed force units. And then you go down through the information warfare activities such as creating information confusion, corruption of data, such as changing GPS coordinates and the like. So there's a wide range of things that Cyber Command can do in the offensive space, and there's a very much larger range of tasks they have in the defensive space, but it's a little bit less interesting to think about the defensive space. I'll leave that to some other people. One of the challenges in understanding Cyber Command and its capability is to try to document the weapons at its disposal. So for example, in 2009 there was discussion, I think really for the first time in the public domain by a United States military leader about the idea of attacking nuclear ballistic missiles in flight or just before launch by cyber means. So General Cartwright, who was at the time the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, went public with a statement about how the United States was developing this capability. And then it was in 2017 that there was a report in the New York Times that the United States in fact had developed this capability and used it against North Korean missiles. So that leads us to the question of, well, what's the variety of cyber weapons that an organisation like Cyber Command needs? Well, it needs a particular cyber weapon to attack nuclear command and control, to attack, it's a different cyber weapon to attack the guidance systems of a missile. It's a different cyber weapon to attack the Chinese theatre commands versus the Russian theatre commands. So what we find is that instead of having a suite of artillery weapons or a suite of torpedoes or some such, in cyberspace we have a range of weapons which have got to be devoted to single sets of targets, single sets of information technology that they're targeting. Bullets 2 and 3 here are quite interesting. They're excerpts from the latest vision statement from the Commander of US Cyber Command. And it goes to the question, often put on the table by academics, that you can only use a cyber weapon once. And once you've used it, the adversary knows about it, will fix up everything, and you will never use it again. Well, that's far from true. But General Nakasone more or less alludes to that proposition with these two slightly contradictory statements in the 2018 vision statement, where he says that no target remains static and no advantage is permanent. And that's really the proposition that we can collect a lot of intelligence on a target, go and attack it, but the moment you've attacked it, things will change and you probably won't get that access again. But then he says, not too far later, that accesses and payloads can remain useful for extended periods. And I think that's a reality, especially against countries which are very weak at cyber defences. And Nakasone makes the other sort of obvious point flowing from that there's got to be a process of continual reassessment. But the next bit is what I found most interesting from him, is the proposition that they're using the teams in Cyber Command in ways that they didn't really imagine when they set them up. So what that's sort of alluding to is a high degree of flexibility in the way they use their resources. So in a moment I'm going to show you a bit of an organisation chart which will give you numbers of different types of cyber teams. But what's clearly the case is that Cyber Command, like NSA, like any good intelligence agency, will draw in assets and resources for particular tasks, regardless in a sense of their formal day-to-day mission or other circumstances. So I apologise if you can't read that in great detail, but there's three main elements to Cyber Command. I have to go, that's here. The least interesting one from my point of view is the defence of the DoD information networks, which is the column on the far right. And we see that they've got a relatively small number of cyber protection teams devoted to that task, only 6. There are a total of 133 cyber teams that Cyber Command has put together in different formations. And it's a fairly low number of personnel assigned to the defence of the DoD networks. One explanation for that is, of course, that there are private contractors who are doing it. There's a huge structure inside the defence departments under the Defence Department Chief Information Officer, whose job is security of the networks. It's not the job of the military uniformed Cyber Command. Where we start to get a bit more interesting is the assets for the Cyber Command that are assigned to national missions, which is a centre column, and then support of combatant commands on the left-hand column. And we start to see the sorts of numbers that are involved. Imagine that each team is on average about 50 people. So we've got 13 times 50 assigned to really offensive cyber missions of a national character. We've got 27 times 50 teams assigned to theatre commands. Now, we've got quite a few theatre commands and other commands, the combatant commands, so that doesn't go very far. But we can't imagine, for example, that in 2020, if we start the year with X number of teams assigned to, say, the Indo-Pacific Command, that in mid-2020 they're still working for Indo-Pacific and they're not doing something for Central Command for a Middle East contingency. So this gives us a bit of a flavour of the complexity of the organisation, and we have a general idea of the numbers involved very broadly. So it'd be great if we had access to plans and operations for Cyber Command, but we don't. So we can only, in a sense, speculate. I've referred to the proposition of intercepting North Korean ballistic missiles in flight. The British government put on the table the proposition that one of their contingencies was preparation to black out Moscow. One might imagine that the United States government plans similar things. One might imagine, based on recent events, that the United States would not have too many reservations about causing an Iranian aircraft to crash. Technically possible, very relatively easy in fact, nor would the United States think twice about the need to try to immobilise Chinese naval assets on their way to a Taiwan contingency. And if we don't understand these operational plans of an organisation like Cyber Command, we don't really know a lot. So it's with humility that I'm sort of standing here and saying, well, let's try and understand Cyber Command, but we really don't have access to some of the most important things that we need. Marcus will say a little bit perhaps later about some of the dilemmas of using cyber power. I've just put a couple of illustrative ones up for discussion. The United States has put in place the Cyber Deterrence Initiative. It's been in place now for over a year. Is it too soon to know whether cyber deterrence is working? I think a lot of Americans have confidence that it will work, but we really don't have the evidence in yet whether countries like Iran, North Korea and China have been deterred in any way after over a year of active defence operations by the United States. We are in a situation where Cyber Command has committed itself in public to active defence against the four bad actors in cyberspace: Russia, China, North Korea and Iran simultaneously. Is that a question, will that be a question of overstretch in due course, or can they handle it? I think they can handle it. A third sort of potential risk is that of fratricide, as in nuclear warfighting, the idea that you launch one nuclear missile in the wrong place, you might undercut the impact of other nuclear strikes at the same time. This idea in cyberspace is that if, for example, as Marcus mentioned to me the other day, if you attack the electric grid of a city, you run the risk of undermining the deployed cyber assets that you've got in place for attacking more critical assets inside that city. If all the power goes off, the enemy's IT systems don't work, but nor do your logic bombs that you've planted. Another interesting consideration around impacts and risks of cyberspace is the role of the military commander in exercising judgment and taking risks in the use of these assets. And what we've seen, in fact, in the United States case is a fairly measured approach to the deployment and use of these assets. I mentioned that even by 2012, US policy was that only the President could authorise offensive cyber strikes. By the time we got to 2018, that's been broken down a bit. But we don't have a long litany of American non-espionage cyber strikes from the time they started having the capability. It's a very small number on the record and in the public domain. One wonders if were the commanders or the political leaders who had a little bit more daring or imagination, whether they might have done more. And I think as we go forward, we'll see greater reliance on the initiative of individual military leaders in exploiting some of the options. Okay, starting to wrap up. Quiz questions answered. How many person years have been spent by the US DoD to develop cyber weapons since 1990? I think we can make a reasonable estimate of around 50,000 person years. Divide by 23 years for the creation of Stuxnet. That leaves you with the answer to the next question in part. How many unique cyber weapons does Cyber Command have at its disposal? Well, the answer is probably unknowable, but it's a very large number, of the order of 5,000 at least. And we could go even bigger because the number of documented vulnerabilities with various types of equipment globally is a very large number, in excess of 100,000, not of the order of 5,000. So what are the secrets of US success in cyberspace? Apart from the early start I mentioned, I did allude to the question of the industrial base, the universities and the allies. But the single most important element of United States capability that enables it to occupy this pole position as the dominant cyber power is the way in which it integrates all of the assets, military to military, single service to single service, intelligence to combat, and then the civil sector to the military. So we have these information gaps. We face them in all humility, in a sense, but we need to start collecting against them. We're not going to proactively go out there to subvert the secrecy and confidentiality regimes of governments. We're going to look for ways to find that information in the public domain. But in all of our assessments, we have to be very conscious that we're reflecting on how the operational secrecy impacts our knowledge. And one of the reasons why the academic community is not prepared to recognise the transformational character of cyber military capability is that they are good academics. And if they can't find the evidence in the public domain, then they're not really going to be writing long articles about things that are just not testified to or evidence in the public domain. Another big information gap in the study of cyberspace is understanding the balance between precision weapons, those that can target the North Korean ballistic nuclear missiles in flight, versus something like WannaCry, which is a random, globally dispersed attack. And for a country like the United States, the idea of precision weapons will be pretty fundamentally important for all sorts of legal, political and social reasons. Getting information on weapons testing in cyberspace is very tough. But another information gap really is around the assumptions we have around US weaknesses in cyberspace and adversary strengths. And so, for example, in our work on cyber coercive capability, we're doing a series of country studies which are trying to illuminate the objective strengths of different countries. So, for example, in the China case study, we say its cyber defences are weak to very weak. But I read a survey the other day that over 50% of Chinese students studying information security believe that their information security is more powerful and more protective than that in the United States. So there's a whole realm of perception and misperception which plays into any net assessment we try to make of the relative capability of these states. So to finish off, our program is called the Cyberspace and Future Conflict Program. We're trying to understand these capabilities in cyberspace for their own sake, in their own right, but we also want to understand how they play out into strategies for future war. And what I've learnt, and this is really a personal observation, that as we go through all of these things that look like objective facts about different things, incomplete objective fact pictures, I think we end up in a situation where we have to look a lot more to the personality of individual commanders to understand whether or not they will exploit these technologies in the way that, to the full potential that they offer, whether they'll have that degree of daring, that degree of risk-taking. So the revolution in military affairs is probably not an objective reality. It's a reality determined only when we find the commanders who are prepared to take the risks and exploit those technologies to the full. So thank you, James. That's it for me.
Great, thanks. Marcus, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Greg. I'm just going to do a couple of things. I'm just going to give a few personal reflections on Cyber Command, and then I'm just going to talk a bit more about the wider context within IISS for the work that Greg has been describing. On Cyber Command, you mentioned, world leading, ahead of everybody else, and I would point to a number of factors. One is sheer scale, mass. That is of people, that is of technical investment, that is of historic research and development. I would point to clarity of strategic direction and doctrinal thinking. I would point to clarity of command over the military components of US cyber. Clearly operational experience, and you've gone back to 1999 there. And I would also point to, and you alluded to this, the massive benefit of its co-location with the NSA and the dual hatting of its commander. I still think there are things, and I'm sure the US is thinking about these things, there are things for the US to think about. I'm going to just say 5 things. Starting with the last point I made, if Cyber Command were to lose its close connection with NSA, my observation is that it doesn't have the same depth and continuity of expertise as that organisation, and it clearly relies on certain NSA specialist functions for what it does, of which perhaps the most obvious example is decryption capability. Secondly, I'm sure the US system will be thinking about how it ensures an operational continuum in peacetime and war between its military and its civilian-run cyber components going beyond NSA, so covert cyber operations from other parts of the US intelligence community. So it ensures it has the necessary operational agility to be able to move between those different capabilities. Thirdly, I'm sure the US system will be conscious of its own massive dependencies and vulnerabilities in cyberspace, with its mission to protect its own networks remaining a very high priority. So you can have an academic interest. Previous cyber commanders I've spoken to will always say that their priority mission has to be first off to protect their own networks, and of course they developed such a capability there. That capability goes beyond just thinking about the defence of Department of Defence networks to thinking wider government. Perhaps the key thing, of course, Cyber Command does is it operates offence and defence together in an integrated way, and in the end, that's the crucial point. You can't really think of them separately, and of course, the classic example is Cyber Command will not be developing cyber weapons, to use that phrase, that it can't defend against. You'd be mad to do so. Fourth point, I'm sure the US, together with close allies, will be continuing to ensure the wider international community understands how existing international law applies to actions undertaken via cyberspace, both in armed conflict and in the grey zone between peace and war that frankly sees daily confrontation in cyberspace, and as some people describe as a new steady state in the statecraft between nations. So yes, that includes whether and how deterrence theory applies to cyberspace, how norms of behaviour can become real, and ultimately a clear definition of what separates responsible from irresponsible cyber actors. And indeed, I've recently talked through with a number of practitioners how targeting processes can work for cyber capabilities in exactly the way as they would work for other capabilities, with the proper consideration of the risk of civilian harm and collateral damage and the need for proportionality. Without commenting on any of the alleged attribution that's out there, Stuxnet was a precise, a targeted weapon with a kill switch. It was designed to do a very specific thing, and even though it went further, it didn't do than it was meant to. It didn't do damage, and you compare that with something like NotPetya, and you mentioned WannaCry, pretty indiscriminate. That's two examples of what you could consider a responsible cyber actor and perhaps irresponsible cyber actor. Fifthly, I am sure the US system is paying close attention to the contesting by particularly China of the US's erstwhile domination of the physical underpinnings of cyberspace, the software, applications, switches, routers, cables, microchips and the like, and that is probably the real reason for putting Huawei on its entities list and why the US is leaning on his allies. I'm sure there might be questions. Okay, the wider context for the work that Greg is doing. We kicked off this work in February last year. We have developed a methodology for assessing the overall cyber capability of states. Big debate over the term cyber power, which is where we started, but it does cause one or two problems because, of course, cyber capability, if you think about it, is really used to exert levers of power that we know very well: military power, economic power, geopolitical power. It's just a new way of being able to do that. And secondly, because there's a slight analytic trap there, a state might look like it is not cyber powerful because, despite being extremely capable, it has very high thresholds for its use of that particular cyber capability. For example, Iran and North Korea have used cyber capabilities as a staple of statecraft for a while, but does that of itself make them cyber powerful? Assessing cyber capability gives us a proper understanding of latent power, whether it is used or not, with the understanding that any state's threshold for use of cyber can be crossed. So it's more important to understand the underpinning latent power, the capability of that particular state. Our methodology settled on 8 categories for assessment. There are other methodologies that cover some of what I'm about to say, but we're aiming to be holistic. First, obviously, national direction, national strategy, national doctrine, including, but not only, military strategy and doctrine. Secondly, a nation's protective cyber capability, its cyber security. This category includes resilience, contingency, and integration with a whole-of-nation approach, the gold standard. And by whole of nation, we're talking about how the public and private sectors work together and how they take in advice to the wider population and even the role that the wider population plays in that cyber security. Thirdly, a nation's, here's terminology problem number 2. Some people use the term offensive cyber. You've heard us use the term coercive cyber. Some people will talk about computer network attack, computer network operations, cyber effects, cyber information operations, information warfare, to name a few. All of those terms have some sorts of problem. The one that most people have been using is the term offensive cyber. The trouble is most people tend to think of that as only, because it's got the word offensive as being by militaries for military effect, when we mean far wider stuff. We've tried coercive cyber. It flies with some people. It doesn't with others. This is one of the things we continue to test. What is the right term? Of course, the term of art that is used extensively in the media is offensive cyber. We mean something, all those activities covered by all the names I've just talked about, both civilian and military, from tactical influence capabilities all the way through to full-on destructive ones. That's a third area we are trying to understand in terms of a state's cyber capability. Fourthly, a nation's core cyber intelligence capabilities and consequent situational awareness, the sort of thing my old organisation GCHQ and its UK intelligence community partners deliver for the UK. Fifthly, the extent to which a nation is digitally empowered and or dependent. A really important point here is a nation without a large dependence on the internet, or one that switches it off its dependence in a conflict, safer. Of course, they lack the advantages. They don't have the ability to access and analyse data at massive scale and speed, and all that comes with that, militarily, economically, and geopolitically. But they're also, if they switch off or aren't connected to the internet, less vulnerable to damaging cyber attacks. Fact. So it is both and. Digital dependence empowers nations while also adding new vulnerabilities. Sixth, a nation's ability to shape and or adapt to the global cyber future, setting international standards, research and development and innovation, ownership of the environment, including physical infrastructure, an effective indigenous digital industry, personnel capacity and skills. This is a vital strategic category, if you think about it, for very obvious reasons, and is really where I think the current 5G Huawei battleground is. The seventh category, a nation's ability to operate in an alliance. Eighth category, how a nation is actually using its capability to include any constraining or enabling factors, and this includes political will and legal and ethical frameworks. In-house, we've currently assessed approximately 15 states using that methodology, the usual suspects and a number who are not, so we're properly testing the efficacy of the methodology. It's obviously based on as much objective measurement as possible, but as Greg has referred to, some of that is quite difficult with some of the sources we're dealing with, so it's also going to rely on facts-based judgments by experts. Our aim is to publish all of this in the spring or early summer as a compendium, and separately we're lifting the component of our assessment that is about military-owned capability for inclusion in the IISS military balance publications. We've chosen military-owned capability because, of course, civilian capabilities in cyber can be used for military effects. Military capabilities in cyber can be used for non-military effects. Where do you draw the line? We've decided to draw the line around military-owned capabilities, but while putting a caveat that says that's not the full military capability of a state. That's a long way of saying, please watch this space. You're going to see the results of all this work in the not too distant future, and we hope it's going to be extremely informative. But just to really make the point, what Greg has described, if you think about it, is the military offensive component of US cyber. Our assessment broadens way beyond even just the military aspect of the offensive side, and then adds in all the other bits that contribute to a state's overall cyber capability. And I think we're now at the point of questions.